Welcome. Let's get you caught up on the main stories making news around the world today.
We've got quite a range. New pope has been elected. There's a legal fight brewing between Mexico and Google.
Also looking at a controversial U.S. refugee plan for Afrikaners, Victory Day in Moscow, and continuing issues with aid getting into Gaza.
Plus, a student released in the U.S., a drone conflict heating up between India and Pakistan, spy arrests in Ukraine.
The verdict on that famous Sycamore Gap tree, a U.S.-UK trade deal, an informer in Hong Kong, and ongoing doubts about the ceasefire in Ukraine.
Quite a packed agenda.
It certainly is. Let's start with the Vatican, a new Pope, Leo XIV.
That's right. Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, who is actually the first American to lead the Catholic Church. He's the 267th Pope.
And his first message.
In his first Mass, he spoke about the Church needing to be a beacon to illuminate dark nights. He warned against a lack of faith and people turning to, well, things like technology, money, power, or pleasure instead.
So calling for a return to core values.
Exactly. And emphasizing unity among the cardinals, positioning himself as a faithful administrator. There have been a lot of joyous reaction, especially in the U.S., obviously, and also Peru.
Peru. Why Peru specifically?
He spent about 20 years there as Bishop of Chiclayo. He even got Peruvian nationality back in 2015.
Interesting. And his first words to the crowds, did they give any clues about his direction?
He spoke of a missionary church, one that builds bridges, which holds dialogues, which is always open. It echoes Pope Francis's calls for peace.
And world leaders have reacted.
Yes, congratulations came in, including from U.S. President Trump, who noted the great honor of having the first American pope.
It seems like a rapid rise for him, becoming cardinal only last year.
It was quite quick. He was made archbishop and then cardinal in 2023 and now pope following Francis's death. Many see him as aligned with the sort of progressive stance of Pope Francis.
A champion of human rights, the poor.
Right. Vatican watchers felt Francis might have been grooming him as a successor. His background is as an Augustinian missionary working with marginalized communities in Peru.
Has he commented on U.S. politics before?
He has. He's been critical of some U.S. administration policies in the past, including on immigration, and even some comments made by Vice President J.D. Vance.
So potential challenges there, leading the church amid global conflicts and perhaps some political friction.
Definitely. His upcoming appearances, like Sunday's Regina Coeli prayer and a news conference on Monday, will be watched very closely.
And the speed of the conclave.
It suggests a pretty strong consensus formed quickly among the cardinals about his suitability. Key themes were apparently continuity with Francis's outreach and the need for unity to bridge internal divides.
So he was seen as someone who supported Francis, but could also appeal to other factions.
That seems to be the perception. And his dual U.S.-Peruvian nationality might be seen as a way to connect different global perspectives, tying back to that building bridges theme he mentioned right away.
Okay. Now, shifting to North America, Mexico versus Google. What's this about?
Mexico is actually suing Google. The issue is that Google renamed the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America for users within the United States on Google Maps.
And Mexico says Google ignored their requests to stop this.
That's President Claudia Sheinbaum's claim, yes. Repeated requests were ignored. Google hasn't commented publicly on the suit yet.
But this name change has backing in the U.S.
It does. The U.S. House of Representatives, which is Republican-led, voted to officially rename the Gulf for use by federal agencies, and President Trump issued an executive order back in January.
What was the reasoning behind that?
The argument was essentially that the U.S. does, quote, most of the work there, and it's ours.
But Mexico disputes the authority to rename the whole thing.
Right. They argue Trump's order only applies to the U.S. portion of the continental shelf, not the entire body of water. Sheinbaum had warned Google about legal action before this.
How does Google explain its actions?
They're calling it a long-standing practice to follow official government name changes. They stress the name won't change for users in Mexico, and others will see both names, like Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America.
This reminds me, didn't the Associated Press have issues with the White House over this name change?
Yes, they refused to adopt the new name and reportedly faced restricted access as a result. It's part of a pattern, perhaps. President Trump also hinted during a visit to Saudi Arabia about potentially renaming the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Gulf.
Which would likely provoke a strong reaction from Iran.
Absolutely. Iran's foreign minister reacted very strongly to that possibility. These naming disputes can be incredibly sensitive.
Indeed. Now, another U.S.-involved story, this time concerning South Africa, a plan to accept white Afrikaners as refugees.
Yes, and South Africa is criticizing this plan. It could apparently start as early as next week. U.S. partner CBS reported on a document calling resettlement a priority for the Trump administration.
And South Africa's view.
Their foreign ministry called it politically motivated and designed to undermine their constitutional democracy.
This stems from a Trump executive order from February.
That's right. The order described Afrikaners as victims of racial discrimination, opening the door for this potential refugee status.
Is South Africa trying to stop people from leaving?
No. They said they won't block departures. But they do want assurances about proper vetting and that individuals leaving don't have pending criminal charges against them.
South Africa denies the discrimination claims.
They do. They deny allegations of discrimination against the white minority and reject claims that farm violence specifically targets white farmers based on race, though some white farmer groups maintain this is the case.
What has the U.S. State Department said officially?
A spokesperson confirmed they're interviewing individuals, prioritizing Afrikaners in South Africa who are victims of unjust racial discrimination. But they didn't confirm a start date for resettlement.
This ties into accusations about land seizures too, doesn't it?
Yes. The Trump administration has accused South Africa of seizing land from white farmers without compensation, which Pretoria denies. And figures like Elon Musk have been very critical, even claiming genocide against white farmers.
And there are reports of a welcome event being planned.
Apparently, U.S. officials are planning something at Dulles Airport for the first group, said to be 54 Afrikaners.
South Africa pointed out a certain irony here, right?
They did, highlighting the U.S. accepting what they see as an economically privileged group while often denying asylum to more vulnerable individuals from other parts of the world.
Okay, let's turn to Moscow. Victory Day commemorations were held.
Yes, President Putin led the events, including the parade in Red Square. Security was notably heightened, likely due to recent Ukrainian strikes.
And China's President Xi Jinping was there.
He was, standing alongside Putin. Putin used the occasion to draw parallels between WWII lessons and the current invasion of Ukraine, which Russia calls its special military operation.
Any changes in the parade itself?
For the first time, trucks carrying combat drones were part of the display, reflecting their heavy use in the Ukraine conflict.
Russia announced a ceasefire for the event.
They did, a unilateral 3-day ceasefire. But Ukraine rejected it, calling it a theatrical show and a farce. Kyiv accused Russia of numerous attacks since the ceasefire supposedly began.
And Russia's response?
Moscow claims it observed the ceasefire and blames Ukraine for violations. Meanwhile, Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz expressed hope for a more substantial ceasefire, maybe even 30 days, putting the responsibility on Moscow.
What was the atmosphere like in Moscow?
Heavy security, lots of restrictions. About 11,000 troops marched, including, reportedly, 1,500 veterans from the Ukraine war, led by Ground Forces Commander Oleg Salyukov and inspected by the new Defense Minister Andrei Belousov.
Putin's speech covered familiar themes.
Yes, insisting Russia is an indestructible barrier against Nazism, Russophobia, anti-Semitism, continuing the false narrative of Ukraine's leadership being Nazis. He also claimed broad public support for the war effort.
Xi Jinping's presence was obviously significant.
Hugely significant. Russia reported 27 world leaders attended, but Xi, wearing the orange and black St. George ribbon associated with Victory Day, and the presence of over 100 marching Chinese soldiers, really stood out.
State TV played this up.
Absolutely, emphasizing the highest ever level of relations between Russia and China positioned against the collective West.
Were other countries represented militarily?
Contingents from North Korea, Vietnam, and Mongolia were present, though the North Koreans didn't actually march. Putin personally greeted a 3-star North Korean general, Kim Young-bok, believed to command North Korean forces in Russia.
And Kim Jong-un made a gesture too.
He visited the Russian embassy in Pyongyang. Other notable attendees included Brazil's Lula da Silva, Venezuela's Maduro, Serbia's Vučić, and Slovakia's Robert Fico, the only EU leader there.
The EU wasn't happy about Fico attending.
No, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas advised against participation. Serbia, an EU candidate country, expects consequences for Vučic's attendance.
How did Putin frame Xi's visit?
He clearly viewed it as very important, praising the courageous people of China and referencing WWII alliances.
Taiwan had something to say about that historical narrative.
They did. They criticized both Beijing and Moscow for distorting history, stating that Chinese communist forces made no substantial contribution in WWII, unlike the Republican government forces at the time.
Putin and Xi also held talks.
Yes, before the parade, discussing Ukraine and other issues, the parade itself displayed Russian hardware like Yars missile systems, tanks, and armored carriers, with a flyover by Su-25 jets.
Did Ukraine react to the parade directly?
President Zelensky had warned against attending. One Ukrainian military analyst suggested Kiev might hold back from attacks due to the foreign leaders present, but noted Moscow was a legitimate military target.
And Zelensky countered the ceasefire proposal.
Yes, during his evening address, he said Ukraine was ready for a full ceasefire starting right now, but only if it was real, meaning no Russian strikes or assaults. Ukraine claims thousands of truce violations by Russia.
While Russia claims it only reacted mirror-like to Ukrainian violations.
That's their position. Although there was a report of a woman killed by a Russian drone in the Zaporizhia region during the supposed truce.
Zelensky dismissed Putin's offer as a game.
He did, and pushed for that longer 30-day truce, which has support from European allies and the U.S. He spoke with President Trump about it.
Trump reiterated the call for a ceasefire.
Yes, on Truth Social, calling for an unconditional ceasefire and warning of more sanctions if Russia didn't comply.
So Xi's presence in Moscow, it's a balancing act for China.
Very much so. It shows closeness to Putin, but also highlights how carefully China has to maneuver, given Russia's international isolation and China's own crucial economic ties with the U.S. and Europe.
Did Xi send any message to Trump?
He reportedly told Trump their bond is unbreakable. But interestingly, both Xi and Putin jointly criticized Trump's proposed Golden Dome missile defense shield.
Calling it destabilizing.
Deeply destabilizing, yes, and potentially weaponizing space. It fits their shared vision of an alternative world order challenging U.S. dominance.
And the war has shifted the power dynamic between them.
Undoubtedly. Russia is now far more reliant on China due to the war and Western sanctions.
Okay, let's move to the Middle East. The aid situation in Gaza.
Right. The U.S. has confirmed a new system to get humanitarian aid into Gaza, bypassing the ongoing Israeli blockade, which is now in its third month. This will involve private companies.
How will this work?
U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, described setting up distribution centers protected by private security contractors. The initial aim is to reach over 1 million people. He stressed the goal is to prevent Hamas from diverting aid.
Is Israel involved in the delivery itself?
Huckabee denied Israeli participation in the actual delivery or distribution, but said Israeli forces would secure the perimeters of these centers.
And the UN's reaction?
UN agencies are refusing to cooperate.
Yeah.
They see the plan as potentially weaponizing aid and not aligning with established humanitarian principles.
OCH spokesperson was quite clear on this.
Yes. Jens Lurk said, "We will not participate only in efforts that are in line with our principles." He saw no reason to create a parallel system that clashes with those principles.
Remind us of the context here. The blockade started when?
Israel cut off all supplies to Gaza's 2.1 million residents back in early March. It's caused a severe humanitarian crisis. We're seeing terrible consequences. A third of Gaza's community kitchens have had to shut down, including World Central Kitchen's operations, due to food and fuel shortages. Prices for basics like flour have skyrocketed, apparently up 30-fold in some cases.
And the U.S. administration sees this new plan as urgent.
Huckabee said President Trump views Gaza aid as urgent and tasked his team to speed up delivery. The recurring accusation from the U.S. and Israel is that Hamas diverts aid meant for civilians.
But the UN disputes that.
The UN and other agencies argue they have strong supervision mechanisms. They say looting largely stopped when aid volumes increased previously, and the WHO stated no medical supplies have been looted.
So the U.S. is pushing this private initiative ahead of Trump's trip to the Gulf.
It seems they're trying to build momentum, likely hoping to secure funding from Gulf countries. A specific non-governmental organization, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, has been registered for this.
Do we know how GHF plans to operate?
A document seen by our correspondent outlines 4 initial distribution sites for food, water, and hygiene kits, aiming to reach 1.2 million people eventually, and then all Gazans.
And their justification.
GHF states that the conflict has collapsed traditional relief channels, and their model is independent, rigorously audited, to get aid directly to those in need, guided by humanitarian principles.
Any familiar names involved with GHF?
The board and advisors reportedly include a former CEO of World Central Kitchen and potentially David Beasley, the former head of the UN's World Food Program, though his participation isn't confirmed. Details on the ground mechanism are still scarce.
All this is happening against the backdrop of the ongoing war.
Exactly. Since the Hamas-led attacks last October and Israel's subsequent military campaign, over 52,700 Palestinians have reportedly been killed. Israel's Security Cabinet also recently approved intensifying the Gaza offensive.
That offensive includes plans that drew international condemnation.
Yes, potentially displacing the population further south, seizing territory, and controlling aid distribution themselves. The UK's Minister for the Middle East, Hamish Falconer, expressed grave concern about whether Israel's plans align with humanitarian principles.
And the U.S. briefed the UN Security Council on this new private aid plan.
Yes, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff did that. Meanwhile, Israeli media reports suggest forces are setting up distribution hubs in Rafah, described as a sterile zone free of Hamas.
How would distribution work there, according to those reports?
Israel apparently expects aid to be given to family representatives who have been security screened, and they'd have to collect it on foot. They estimate about 70 kilograms of aid per family per week is needed.
With the Israeli military staying outside the hubs during distribution.
That's the plan, according to these reports. The argument from the U.S. and Israel is that this system prevents Hamas from stealing aid and reduces its influence.
But there are major questions about feasibility.
Huge questions. The current UN system uses around 400 distribution points. This new plan seems much smaller scale, while warnings of mass starvation continue. UN officials conducted a careful analysis before deciding not to participate.
UNICEF raised specific concerns.
Yes, spokesman James Elder warned it could cause more child suffering. Civilians, including the most vulnerable, would have to travel to these militarized zones. He also worried the southern location could be bait for forced displacement, given 90% of Gazans are already displaced.
And the volume of aid is an issue.
The plan apparently envisages only about 60 truckloads daily. That's far less than needed, maybe a tenth of what got through during the previous ceasefire. OCA's Jens Lerke called the Israeli proposals insufficient.
So this impasse is dangerous.
Analysts say it threatens the entire UN humanitarian operation in Gaza and could set a dangerous precedent. Meanwhile, tons of aid sit waiting at border crossings.
What are people inside Gaza saying?
Reports from places like Jabalia in northern Gaza describe growing despair, chaotic scenes at food handouts. Residents are pleading for borders to open and say they won't move south again just to get aid. The concern is reaching the most vulnerable and avoiding further displacement.
A truly desperate situation. Okay, let's shift back to the U.S. A Turkish student, Rumeysa Öztürk, has been released from detention.
Yes, she's a student at Tufts University. A federal judge ordered her freed from an immigration detention facility in Louisiana.
And the judge was critical of the government's case.
Very critical. Judge William Sessions said Öztürk met the conditions for release and essentially lambasted the government's arguments against her.
What led to her detention?
She co-authored an opinion piece critical of Israel's war in Gaza. Her arrest followed a White House crackdown on alleged anti-Semitism on university campuses.
The judge saw a free speech issue.
Absolutely. He stated her continued detention chills the speech of millions in this country who are not citizens. She'd been held for 6 weeks after being arrested by masked, plainclothes officers in Massachusetts back in March, sparking protests.
What was the specific accusation from Homeland Security?
DHS accused her of engaging in activities in support of Hamas, end quote. After the ruling, a DHS spokesperson reiterated that student visas are a privilege and they remain committed to removing aliens with no legal right to be in the U.S.
Wasn't there an earlier order about transferring her?
Yes, the judge had previously ordered her transferred to Vermont immigration authorities. But then on Friday, he ordered her immediate release without any travel restrictions.
Did Öztürk testify?
She did, virtually. She spoke about her Fulbright scholarship, her PhD work. She also mentioned her asthma worsening during detention and actually had an attack during her testimony. The judge heard from her doctor and a Tufts professor, too. The government didn't call any witnesses.
And the judge found the op-ed was the main evidence.
He said it was the only evidence presented against her, raising very substantial First Amendment and due process violation claims. He explicitly stated there is no evidence that she has engaged in violence or advocated violence.
How did the ACLU and Tufts react?
The ACLU, representing her, was delighted, stressing the First Amendment principle. Tufts University said they were pleased and looked forward to her return.
This isn't an isolated case, is it?
No, the Trump administration has detained several international students who have supported Palestinians. Just last week, another judge ordered the release of Mohsen Madawi, a Columbia student and permanent resident. and a Columbia graduate, Mahmoud Khalil, remains in detention without charge.
Okay, now turning to South Asia. Tensions between India and Pakistan seem to have escalated significantly. A drone war.
That's how some are describing it.
Yeah.
The first real drone war between the two nuclear-armed neighbors. India accused Pakistan of launching waves of drones and missiles at military bases in India and Indian-administered Kashmir.
Pakistan denies this.
Islamabad denies launching attacks, but claims to have shot down 25 Indian drones. Delhi has been publicly silent on those claims.
Experts are worried.
Very. They see these tit-for-tat attacks using unmanned weapons across that volatile border as a dangerous new phase. Washington and other powers are urging restraint. Drones are silent, remote, deniable. It changes the game.
What did one expert say?
Professor Jahara Matisik from the U.S. Naval War College put it starkly. Indo-Pak conflict is moving into a new drone era. The side that masters drone warfare won't just see the battlefield, they'll shape it.
There have been casualties reported?
Yes. Pakistan claimed Indian airstrikes and cross-border fire killed 36 and injured 57 in Pakistan, and Pakistan-administered Kashmir since Wednesday. India reported 16 civilian deaths from Pakistani shelling on its side.
India says its actions were retaliation.
Retaliation for a deadly militant attack on tourists in Pahalgam last month. India blames Pakistan-based groups. Islamabad denies any role and says India hasn't provided evidence.
And Pakistan's claim of downing 25 Indian drones. What kind were they?
Reportedly, Israeli-made Harap drones downed over cities like Karachi, Lahore, and Rawalpindi using technical and weapons countermeasures. India, in turn, claimed to have neutralized several Pakistani air defense radars, including near Lahore, which Islamabad also denies.
Drones play multiple roles in modern warfare, right?
Absolutely. Precision strikes using laser-guided munitions, but also reconnaissance, relaying coordinates, laser-designating targets, and crucially, they can be used as decoys, or to suppress enemy air defenses, SIAD, by making radars light up so other weapons can target them.
Like in Ukraine.
Exactly. Professor Matisek notes both Ukraine and Russia use drones this way, making them a force multiplier for degrading air defenses without risking pilots.
What kind of drones does India have?
Experts say their fleet is largely Israeli-made reconnaissance UAVs like the IAI Searcher and Heron, plus loitering munitions, suicide drones like the Harpy and Harap. Using the Harap suggests a shift towards hitting high-value targets precisely. They also have a big deal pending for U.S. MQ-9B Predators.
And Pakistan.
Their drone fleet is described as extensive and diverse, mixing indigenous models like the Barak and Shapar with imports, notably from China, like the CH-4, and Turkey, like the Bayraktar Akinci. They've also developed their own loitering munitions.
So it's an arms race?
Essentially, yes. An analyst in Lahore, Ijaz Haider, mentioned the Pakistani Air Force has been integrating unmanned systems for nearly a decade. Professor Matisek highlighted Israel's pivotal technical help for India versus Pakistan's reliance on Turkish and Chinese platforms.
Is this drone usage comparable to Ukraine?
Not really in scale.
Yeah.
In Ukraine, we see thousands of UAVs used constantly. Indian defense analyst Manoj Joshi suggests deploying drones instead of jets is currently a lower-level military option for India, but it could be a prelude to something bigger.
Or it could be more tactical.
Ijaz Haider thinks the recent drone activity in Jammu looks more like a tactical response to immediate provocations by Pakistan, not a full-scale planned retaliation which would involve more assets.
So the role is more limited and symbolic for now.
It seems so, compared to Ukraine. Both countries are still using manned air forces, too. Manoj Joshi warns this drone warfare might be just the beginning, signaling either de-escalation or escalation.
A potential flashpoint.
Exactly. Professor Matisek points out drones lower the threshold for action, but also create new risks. Every drone shot down, every radar blinded, becomes a potential flashpoint.
Okay, let's move to Europe. Ukraine reporting a Hungarian spy network.
Yes, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, says it has uncovered a state-run Hungarian spy network gathering intelligence on Ukrainian defenses near their shared border. 2 alleged spies have been detained.
What's the SBU claiming specifically?
They're saying for the first time in Ukraine's history, the security service has exposed a Hungarian military intelligence network, conducting espionage activities to the detriment of our state.
And Hungary's reaction?
Initially, Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó urged caution, calling the allegations propaganda until details were provided, noting past anti-Hungarian propaganda in Ukraine. However, he later announced the expulsion of 2 Ukrainian diplomats from Budapest.
This comes amidst tensions between Hungary and Ukraine, despite Hungary being in NATO and the EU.
Right. President Viktor Orbán has often seemed to side with Russia since the full-scale invasion. The alleged network was supposedly set up by Hungary's military intelligence.
What kind of information were they allegedly after?
Data on Ukrainian air defense systems, locations, numbers, and also details about law enforcement officers and vehicles in the western Zakarpattia region, which borders Hungary.
Anything else?
They were also reportedly gathering info on local public sentiment regarding a potential Hungarian incursion, though the SBU didn't explicitly link this plot to aiding Russia.
Who are the detained individuals?
The SBU called them traitors, former members of the Ukrainian military, allegedly supervised by a Hungarian intelligence officer. One suspect supposedly crossed into Hungary regularly to report, receiving money and communication gear. They faced treason charges.
Relations have been strained for a while.
Yes, Orban has tried blocking EU aid to Ukraine, opposed energy sanctions on Russia, and doesn't support Ukraine joining the EU. Hungary's stance within NATO has often been at odds with other members due to its close ties with Russia.
How significant is this alleged network militarily?
In isolation, perhaps relatively minor, given the distance from the main front lines. However, Russia would certainly be interested in the location of any Ukrainian military assets.
What's the broader concern?
Former UK Defense Secretary Sir Ben Wallace noted Ukraine has accused Hungary of subversive activity before, but the military nature of these targets is more serious. He raised the question of who the ultimate recipient of this intelligence might be.
He suggested this could have NATO implications.
Yes, saying what Putin fears most is NATO's values.
Hmm.
If those values are threatened or undermined, then there needs to be some serious discussion within NATO about members that behave that way.
And the timing, with Slovakia's PM attending the Moscow parade.
It certainly won't be welcome news, as NATO tries to maintain unity against Russia. There's also the long-standing issue over the Hungarian minority in Ukraine's Zakarpattia region, around 150,000 people.
Clashes over language rights and identity.
Exactly. Sir Ben Wallace recalled a previous incident where Hungarians were allegedly handing out passports to ethnic Hungarians there, leading to diplomat expulsions. This adds another layer to those tensions.
Okay, shifting to the UK now. The verdict on the Sycamore Gap tree felling.
Yes, Daniel Graham and Adam Carruthers have been found guilty of deliberately cutting down that iconic tree on Hadrian's Wall back in September 2023.
The reaction at the time was huge. What was it like for those who found it?
Park Ranger Gary Pickles described his shock. He got an early morning call from a farmer saying the tree was down, initially thought it was a prank. Driving there, he felt anxiety rising, thinking, it's gone, it's gone.
And seeing it.
He said he had to double take, seeing it lying there. Just shock, a gaping hole in the landscape. Initially, he thought it might be storm damage from Storm Agnes.
But then realized it was deliberate.
On closer inspection, he saw it was chopped down and not blown down, a clean cut. That escalated things massively. He reported it to Northumberland National Park HQ.
Which alerted the National Trust.
Right, including General Manager Andrew Pode. Pode said his phone started lighting up. Once he knew it was deliberate, crisis mode kicked in, trying to inform people before it hit social media.
How did people react to the news?
Pode described it as like ringing people up to tell them that someone had passed away. People said it's like losing a loved one. Staff were in tears. Then photos went viral online.
The story went global very quickly.
Within the hour, Pode said. The National Trust and National Park issued a joint statement confirming it was cut down. Northumbria police called it a deliberate act of vandalism.
The site must have been overrun with media.
A sea of camera tripods, Pode described it. Local reporters first, then international crews. He said it was the biggest press story the National Trust had ever dealt with. The scale of global interest was surprising.
A tranquil spot turned into a media circus.
And a crime scene. Police tape. Forensic officers gathering DNA. The footage of the trunk lying across the damaged Hadrian's Wall was shocking.
Looking back now.
Pode and Pickles reflected on the loss of a massive local landmark. Pode called it senseless, asking who they were trying to get at. He said, it's still a huge part of my life dealing with this. It's a big gap in all our lives, never mind the landscape.
A really sad story. Now on to trade, a new agreement between the US and UK.
Yes, they've agreed to reduce import taxes on some British cars and allow certain amounts of steel and aluminum into the US tariff-free. It offers some relief from new tariffs President Trump had announced since January.
But it's not a complete removal of tariffs?
No, a 10% duty remains on most UK goods. Leaders from both sides hailed it as significant, but some analysts are saying it doesn't really change much from the pre-Trump situation overall.
Was a formal deal actually signed?
It doesn't appear so, and the announcements lacked a lot of specific detail. Labor leader Sir Keir Starmer called it a fantastic platform and a historic deal protecting jobs. President Trump called it a great deal.
What are the specifics we do know?
The U.S. will reduce the car import tax back to 10% for about 100,000 cars a year, roughly current U.K. exports. Tariffs on steel and aluminum will be slashed, with the U.S. setting up quotas, similar to before, and each country will allow imports of up to 13,000 metric tons of beef.
Any benefits projected for the U.S.?
The U.S. claims it creates a $5 billion export opportunity, mentioning ethanol and other agricultural products. The U.S. Agriculture Secretary called it very important.
How did UK industry react?
UK Steel welcomed it as major relief, praising the government's approach. But other business groups, like British American Business, were more cautious, saying it's better than yesterday but not better than 5 weeks ago, basically just restoring the status quo ante.
What about political reactions in the UK?
Labour MPs praised it. Opposition parties wanted more detail and scrutiny. The Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch, was critical, saying the UK lowered tariffs while the US hiked them, calling it being shafted.
The Lib Dems want Parliament to vote.
Yes. Sir Ed Davey said MPs should have a say, arguing the devil will be in the detail, and Trump's tariffs are still hitting UK industries. Nigel Farage of Reform UK called it a step in the right direction and a Brexit benefit.
These talks have been going on a while.
Since Trump's first term, yes. They nearly signed a mini-agreement back then. The U.S. has long pushed for benefits for its farmers and pharmaceutical companies, which are politically tricky for the U.K.
Any progress on this, friends?
The National Cattlemen's Beef Association in the U.S. called it a tremendous win. The U.K. stated there'd be no weakening of food standards for imports. On pharmaceuticals, the U.K. said the U.S. agreed to give British firms preferential treatment, but what that actually means is unclear.
So, still some uncertainty there. Let's move to Hong Kong and the impact of security laws.
We're seeing the effects quite clearly. There's the case of Innes Tang, a former banker and self-described patriot, who has reportedly informed on dozens of people in Hong Kong to the police.
For what kind of alleged violations?
Things like waving the old colonial flag, protest messages on cakes in a bakery, actions he views as violating national security. He says people like him are in every corner of society watching.
This relates to the national security law imposed by Beijing.
Exactly. That law, brought in after the 2019 protests, criminalizes secession, subversion, collusion with foreign forces. Critics say it stifles freedoms and has created this atmosphere of informing. An additional security law, Article 23, tightened things further last year.
How does Tang operate?
He and volunteers apparently collect screenshots from social media, set up a tip-off hotline, and encourage followers to share information. He claims nearly 100 individuals or organizations have been reported, leading to police cases and some jail sentences.
Does he see himself as enforcing the law?
He frames it as proper community police cooperation, just reporting incidents. Of course, the Hong Kong authorities have their own official national security hotline, too, which has received almost 900,000 tip-offs since late 2020.
What's the impact on those reported?
They face relentless pressure. Over 300 people have been arrested for NSL offenses, and it's estimated over 300,000 Hong Kongers have left permanently. People feel watched.
Like the bookshop owner.
Pong Yat-ming, yes. He hosts talks and gets frequent government inspections due to anonymous complaints, 10 visits in 15 days at one point. Political scientist Kenneth Chan jokes he's become radioactive, with some avoiding him due to his pro-democracy views.
What's the government's line on academic freedom?
They say they attach importance to it, but institutions must ensure compliance with the law.
What motivates someone like Tang?
He says it's love for Hong Kong. His views were formed under British rule, which he felt wasn't great for locals. Like many of his generation, he favored unification with China over colonial governance, though perhaps focused more on livelihoods than abstract rights back then.
So he saw the 2019 protests as destabilizing.
Yes, he felt he needed to become active to restore balance and give voice to a silent majority, not supporting independence or disruption.
But protests were a tradition in Hong Kong.
A key way for people to voice opinions without full democracy, as Kenneth Chan points out. He asks, we are no longer a city of protests, so what are we?
And the requirement for only patriots to hold office.
That electoral reform from 2021 means anyone in key government or legislative council, like roles, must swear loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. One commentator, Lu Mon-hung, argues LeCo struggles to function now, with many patriots seen as opportunists, passing policies without real opposition.
Even Tang expressed some concern.
He said he doesn't want every policy passing overwhelmingly, seeing a danger the NSL could be weaponized. Though he also believes stability has returned and has stopped his reporting activities.
What's the broader chilling effect?
In academia, Kenneth Chan says fear leads to self-censorship. Pro-democracy parties have disbanded or are gone from LegCo. Tang himself is now focusing overseas, representing pro-Beijing nonprofits at the UN.
Leaving people like Chan feeling isolated.
He describes a third of his friends in exile, another third in jail, and himself in limbo, unsure if he can continue speaking freely. The government maintains the law targets only a tiny minority.
A stark picture. Finally, let's revisit Ukraine and the ceasefire situation. Still a lot of skepticism.
Extremely high skepticism. Our correspondent drove into the Donetsk region just hours after Russia's announced three-day ceasefire was supposed to start around midnight, May 8th.
And what did they find?
Near the fiercely contested town of Pokrovsk, at a Ukrainian artillery position, they heard continuous explosions, both incoming and outgoing fire. Definitely no ceasefire on that part of the front line.
What did the soldiers say?
One soldier, Serhiy, from the National Guard's 3rd Operational Brigade, said flatly, "Yes, they have been attacking overnight. We have had glide bombs and drones here. Russia can't be trusted. There is no truce." Minutes later, his unit fired their howitzer after receiving target coordinates.
This echoes President Zelensky's rejection of the unilateral ceasefire.
Right. He called for that longer 30-day truce instead, backed by the U.S. President Trump also reiterated the call for a ceasefire on Truth Social and threatened more sanctions.
How are soldiers coping psychologically?
Another soldier, Max, age 26, said you have to have tunnel vision. When you're there, you don't really think about ceasefires.
And civilians further back from the front.
Our correspondent went north to Dobropilya, about 12 miles from Russian lines, where many displaced people live. One woman, Svetlana, originally from Pokrovsk, said, "You can hear the sounds here. That is the sound of Russia's ceasefire. That's why I say we should never trust them."
Others shared that view.
Yes. Serhiy, 26, called the ceasefire announcement an attempt to confuse people and deceive them. An older man, Alexander, at the market said it had been quieter the previous night, but alarms were sounding again. He became emotional talking about fear for his family.
So the announced truce seems largely non-existent on the ground.
That's certainly the picture from the reports we're getting from the Ukrainian side. The mistrust runs incredibly deep.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our roundup today. We've covered a lot from papal elections and geopolitical naming disputes to refugee policies, drone warfare, and the ongoing struggles in places like Gaza and Ukraine.
It really underscores how interconnected global events are, even when they seem disparate. Trade deals affect local jobs, security laws impact individual lives continents away, and conflicts ripple outwards.
It certainly does. As you process all this information, perhaps consider what underlying trends might tip these stories. How do shifts in global power, technology, and national interest play out in these headlines day after day? Something to think about.
Definitely. Staying informed is one thing, but understanding the deeper currents is another challenge entirely.
Thank you for joining us.